begin with Alexander Buzgalin's presentation on the recent protests, etc., in Russia. So all presentations will be about 10 minutes. We keep them brief because the real issue is to have a conversation. So we will have Sasha's presentation, then a brief discussion, then the two other presentations in the same way. Okay, Sasha.
Again, thank you very much for the invitation. And for the future, we have a lot of international contacts. So the problem for selection of people will be more difficult than you can imagine, Radhika. So we have to discuss this question. Coming back to the agenda, my topic of analysis of my academic work is not protest actions, but I participated in social movements more than 40 years from the very beginning. That's why it is my topic as a left person, as Marxist, as a practical militant activist. A few words briefly. First of all, we don't have exact statistic. We don't have now information about protests today, but they started from Vladivostok already, and this is Far East, like China, Pacific Ocean. And they're going now in the center of Russia. About protests 1 week ago, the figures are absolutely different. Official statistic, less than 10,000 people, including 4,000 in Moscow. Statistic of opposition, 200,000 participants. So difference 20 times in estimation of number of participants. In reality, as I could observe, and I think we had around 10,000 protesters in Moscow, and much, much less in all other towns and cities of Russia. Mainly it was big cities with 1 million and more citizens, where life is much better than in all other Russia. So this is statistic. 2,000 people were arrested, but typically for a few hours or 1-2 days. Really no big repressions. And the police was much more mild than in France or in the United States. No, it was no bullets, no water machines, no gas, sometimes sticks, but some demonstrators also were very aggressive and made a lot of provocations, honestly. So it's a very ambivalent situation. This is formal characteristic. Typical age, no concrete statistic, estimation in Moscow, 30 years old is median, more or less. A lot of young people, including some teenagers, 14, 15, 16 years old. It's also an interesting fact. So maybe main questions. First of all, why? Why we had this relatively big explosion of social energy? All rallies were forbidden officially in Russia to organize normal demonstration. Is nearly impossible. It will be a huge headache and you will have space in the forest, not in the center of the city. That's why it is illegal organization of demonstration. Formal prerequisite, arrest of Navalny, but majority of participants did not support Navalny. A few words about this person. He was pure nationalist with some fascist slogans 7 years ago. He was together with the Russian ruling party, United Russia, Единая Россия. He has big financial support all time. In the West, he is living in 5-star hotels and spending $10,000 per day. This is not secret for anybody. So he is representative. Now he became a neoliberal politician with big support of the West and big support of some stratas of Russian establishment, including even secret police and so on. So, because he could not receive all these video materials without support of secret police. So in Russia, we have game of more or less one elite with two wings of this elite. One wing is neoliberal, with neoliberal political, ideological orientation and oriented on the United States. And another wing is more, let's say, conservative, patriotic, and authoritarian and opposing to the West, but with the same neoliberal economic and social policy. No difference. Nobody wants to have free of charge education. Nobody wants to have progressive income tax. Nobody wants to have landification and so on. neither Navalny nor Putin. So here they are together. It's important. But why so big protest, relatively big protest? Because first of all, in Russia, we have more than 10 years stagnation, plus 2% growth, minus 2% growth, very high level of social differentiation, official information, 10% of the richest, 9% of the poorest, 16 times. In the United States, 13 times. In Europe, 7, 8 times. So twice bigger than in Europe. For Russia, with a lot of traditions of equal life, Soviet past, this is awful. 20 million people are under the poverty level. Poverty level is $150 per month, 150 euro per month, maybe. So it's real poverty. And Russia is a very rich country, by the way. We have second or third place as far as number of billionaires, dollar billionaires is concerned. So very high differentiation of wealth, incomes, power, and so on. Power is concentrated in the hands of big capital and top bureaucracy. This is typical for all countries of late capitalism, but in Russia it's very visible. People are tired from this, and they want to have another life. They want to be subjects, not to be passive nobody, I can say. And this is main motivation, especially for those who has artificial but dreams, or dreams but artificial dreams, to be tomorrow in neoliberal world open to the global West, hopes to be rich, successful, free, and so on. This is typical for young generation students who are educated in universities with domination of economics as a religion, as Alan said, the same in political studies, ideology, culture, and so on. But in regions, among protesters were not mainly young people. It was mainly ordinary people who are tired from terrible life, both political oppression, economic poverty, or very low level of incomes, and no hopes, no, how to say, no essence of life. This is very important aspect. So this is a few words about people who participated. About reasons I mentioned, the general situation, the general stagnation, and better to say, internal crisis, which is not open, it's underground, but very deep. And finally, what else? What tomorrow? The situation is very similar with situation in Belarus. If anybody wants, I can say, send English text about Belarus events with analysis. Unfortunately, this is, let's say, 90% the same. Not Ukraine, but Belarus. And for left, there is small space, unfortunately, because we don't have strong trade unions, strong left political organizations. Communist Party of Russian Federation, official party, which is member of the parliament, they have 15%, 15, not 50, but 15% of the seats. They are passive. They did not support protest. I can understand Navalny is terrible right-wing leader, but people are not supporting Navalny mainly. People are against this system. What is big problem of the protests? If this protest movement will have success, Russia can have even worse political and economic system than now. It will be the same economic course, neoliberal economic system, even more, how to say, destructive, because now we have paternalistic behavior, at least in military industrial complex and in some other branches of economy. If people like Navalny will be the leaders, it will be nothing as it was in 1990s when we had terrible crisis. We don't have hopes that neoliberal leaders will bring us democracy. Again, when we had Igor Gaidar and other Yeltsin and other leaders in 1990s, 30, 20 years ago, we had a lot of political repressions, political prisoners, and when we had the protest of parliament against such economic and social policy, parliament was blockaded, and then tanks came to Moscow and thousands of people were killed, arrested, and so on in 1993. So we know very well what can we expect from neoliberal opposition, so-called opposition. That's why I think we left must have our agenda, our own agenda. And we have enormous debates now, what is better, to participate in this protest and to be supporters of Navalny, because we cannot create our own protest actions, or to be against and to support Putin. Both are worse. So situation is really terrible. In chess playing, I think it's Tutswank or something like that, when every step forward is making a situation worse than it is now. I hope we have our own agenda in the future, but now situation unfortunately is not very optimistic. And again, this is not my professional topic of analysis. This is my just brief comments. And if anybody wants to have paper in Russian, I can send. I hope in 2-3 days, Renfrey Clark will make English version of short paper 4 pages. Thank you.
That's great, Sasha, and we would love to post it. By the way, we do run, everybody should know, since some of us are new here today, we do have a website, so we can certainly post these things on the website. So if you have also other things for the website, do send them along. Questions for Sasha, discussion. Maybe I can just start off by saying, Sasha, would you maybe reflect on whether Navalny's return was staged and planned to coincide with the inauguration of the new Biden administration? And what, if any, are the links as you see them?
Really, I cannot comment professionally this topic, this question. I think it is not directly interconnected. In any case, Navalny had planned to come back, and partly because nobody wants to have Navalny in the country. Germany did not want to have him. He is a very he can create any provocations. This is very briefly. I think he is just he is person for destruction. He is not person even for creation of new power. He is symbolic figure and nothing else.
Other comments, questions, discussion? Jeffrey?
I understood that in the elections that took place in Russia, Navalny got 3 or 4% of the vote, which is a really tiny, tiny fraction. And somehow recently, after this so-called attempted murder, and after these events that took place in Germany that also involved the United Kingdom, he then goes back to Russia, and you see the setting in motion of a possibly somewhat larger movement, but still led by a figure who originally was extraordinarily unpopular. And I would have thought it's a sort of repetition, in a way, of what happened in the 1990s in Russia, because were a movement of that kind to come to power, what one would see in Russia is something very, very close to what one saw in the 1990s. So I was very surprised when you said, Putin is an equally, did you say equally bad choice? In a sense, what happened after, the end of the Yeltsin era was that Russia seemed to manage in some ways to put itself back on its feet.
No, I think Sasha said that, in fact, if someone like Navalny comes to power, it will be worse for Russia than things are today. Things are bad, I presume, partly because of the neoliberal turn that even Putin has taken, but they will be worse if some outright neoliberal is in power. So
really, it's difficult to say, because from economic and social point of view, neoliberal neoliberal power, neoliberals in power can create worse situation. You are right, Radik. From ideological, political, historical point of view, it's a big question mark. But there is also one more aspect, which is very important. I don't want to initiate discussion about nature of the Soviet Union, but in our country, this is the question. And people who hate Soviet Union are against Putin, people who like Soviet Union are ambivalent because modern administration, not president himself, it's not so important. By the way, don't overestimate the role of Putin. He is part of the ruling social force. It is mixture of big business, as I said, and top officials, especially military industrial complex. In Russian, we have expression siloviki, those who has power. It's very difficult to translate. Powerful bureaucrats, but power means military force, police, secret police, and all other organs. So this group is reproduce and reintroduce a lot of Soviet forms, not nature, not content, but forms in art, in ideology, in history, in memory. And in some aspects, they reintroduce positive features of Soviet Union in culture and ideology. We have a lot of very good Soviet films in Central TV, for example. We have memory about victory over fascism, and to say fascist in Russia is impossible. You will be beaten by ordinary people and arrested by officials. It's not like in Ukraine. Yeah, we have some positive memory about Soviet Union. Now even Academy of Science proposed grants for those who will write about positive experience of Soviet Union. It's impossible under the neoliberal system. It wasn't, it will be impossible. So that's why we have these elements, but economic social policy is terrible. No real political freedom, even bourgeois political freedom, formal political freedom. Or we have, but small scale. For example, I can participate in Central TV, and I participate sometimes in Central TV, and I can say that economic and social cost of the power is bad, not of president, but of power of the state. But to say that let's go for the meeting against for Navalny, it's impossible. For example, in the first channel, yeah, of Russian TV. In the internet, no problem. You will not be arrested a bit. Sorry, I'll try to stop.
I have three people waiting to ask questions, and there may be more, and Mick wants to come back. So I have, okay, and since Mick is going to come back on this, I'm going to let Mick go, then Jeffrey, Daniel, and Victor. Those are the people I have on my list.
You know, in what sense?
And Alan and Austin. Okay.
Okay. Can you explain in what sense what Putin represents as neoliberalism? I mean, I was very surprised, you know, if you look at his speech at Davos, it was actually an attack on quantitative easing and on the financialization of the economy, which is, you know, something that drives very strongly in a different direction from what we generally refer to as neoliberalism.
Again, formally, he is against liberalism. In Russia, liberal, to say you're liberal, it's like to say you're son of the beach. And even in Central TV, it's the same. Yeah, we have a lot of negative expressions, jokes, anecdotes, and so on. So this is typical for not all population, but 80% of ordinary people. What I mean when I said neoliberal cause, I mean economic policy, economic relations, institutions, and policy. Why? We do not have strong industrial policy. We have mixture of feudal, let's say, hand management. I don't know how to explain, ручное управление. When president can say, you must do this and you must do that for business, or governor or mayor of the city. But this is more feudal model when king or count could say something to business. Yeah, it's not normal elements of planification. We do not have any forms of social state. We don't have progressive income tax, for example. Everybody pays 13%. Poor person and billionaire. Now for rich will be 15%, but it doesn't matter really. We have decline of free of charge education and health care, step by step, and very small spendings for education and health care, and so on and so far. So a lot of trade unions are nearly forbidden, real trade unions are nearly forbidden. Strikes are nearly forbidden, and so on. So it's very difficult for ordinary people. Social differentiation is very high. Real dominant force in economy is huge corporations in oil, gas sector, plus military industrial complex and financial institutions around them. So that's why we have not financialization, we have, I don't know, raw materialization or oilization and financialization of economy, if it is possible to say so.
And
But
I think,
yes, I stop here.
yeah, and I just like to add that I think one very critical way in which practically every major capitalist economy in the third world is neoliberal is by not imposing financial regulation and capital controls, which allows the exceedingly rich people to take their money in and out of these economies without any sanction, without any, with impunity. Okay, so I think what I'll do is, yeah, I mean, monetary and financial policy in Russia is extremely anti-popular. But anyway, I'd like to ask Jeffrey, Daniel, and Victor to take the next. I'll take all three questions first. Then I will do one final round with Alan and Oscar. So, Jeffrey, please.
Yeah, just quickly though, to Mick's last point, and perhaps Alexander can clarify in terms of what he thinks is this being somewhat accurate, but it seems that with Putin, you have this kind of strange hybrid of mixing neoliberalism and feudalism. It's kind of like neoliberalism with a human face or with an aristocratic noblesse oblige face. Rapacious commodity capitalism with neoliberal structures, yet at the same time a recognition that you have to at least give the appearance of the state doing something for people. But I'll leave that aside. My question for you is this, Alexander. We've had these interesting protests occurring almost simultaneously in Belarus and Russia. Belarus this summer, Russia right now. It seems as though in Belarus, there is more to be lost in terms of social policies that retain more of the features of the Soviet Union, although, of course, as we know, the past 5 years have seen many of those social policies rolled back in Belarus, but still possessing more of that progressive social character than Russia does. But to what extent is there, both in practice, cooperation or alliances between activists in Belarus and Russia? And to what degree do you see potential for cooperation and alliances between progressives in Russia and Belarus to try and retain and salvage some of the past progressive features of Soviet policy, such as still exist to some extent in Belarus and to a lesser extent in Russia?
Daniel.
Yes, I believe.
Daniel.
Yes, thank you. My question is somewhat similar, also around the relationship, the comparison with Belarus, because I'm wondering, and not about what they have to lose, which is a lot. I agree with you, Jeffrey. Rather about who's pushing these protests, because as we know, we heard in our excellent session on Belarus a few weeks ago, there's a strong Western push destabilizing the country towards a color revolution situation. And I'm wondering, what concrete information do you have, Alexander, to give us about Western destabilization efforts in Russia? To what extent is there a push towards a color revolution situation? And I know, for example, that the US embassy was recently criticized by the Russian government, or chided for having given information about the protest places and times on their website, saying that this is interventionism into our own internal domestic affairs that is not permissible under diplomatic rules usually. And so are there other ways in which United States or other Western countries are meddling in order to push these protests?
Great, thank you. I didn't know that. That's amazing. And I had Victor.
Okay. Excuse the noise. My kids are running around like crazy boys. It's one of the problems of lockdown is that we can't get them out enough. I mean, I think, the questions that have been raised so far point towards the complexities of a kind of constructive opposition in a place like Russia because of Western pressure and Russia's relationship with China, and obviously the way in which that kind of security alliance of sorts is developing. I wonder if Alexander sees any potential for a more social development or a social switch in government policy in Russia. I think there have been some indications, there were recent controls put on Cyprus, I think, in relation to offshore investments by Russian by the Russian elite. And there have also been increased subsidies to vulnerable sectors of the population, pensioners and so on, and the tax change that you just mentioned. So I wonder, but then people said this a few years ago when Glaziev was appointed to be an economic advisor, and then nothing happened. So I just wonder what you see. Is there a security argument for improving the social situation in Russia? Is that likely?
Great. Sasha, please.
Really, I think I have to prepare the lecture. I teach the course on Russian economic, social, political life. So the questions are very important, and it's necessary to explain a lot of details because we have very specific situation. I start from the last question, Victor. Unfortunately, we do not have hopes for socialization of our economic life. We had very negative pension reforms, 5 years increasing of the ages from 60 to 65. And by the way, we had protest, and this protest gave some positive results. It was not so rapid, not so radical, and so on increase. We were generally defeated, but not as terribly as it was proposed in the first stage. About income tax, nearly everybody speaks about necessity to have progressive income tax, but really we have only 2% increasing for rich, and this is nothing, as I said. No increasing of spendings for education, for healthcare, and so on, even in the situation of pandemic. And for next 3 years, for next 2 years, in the plans, nothing, even decline. So I don't have positive hopes. Unfortunately, for saving of this strange combination of feudalism and neoliberal capitalism, it could be useful to have more social economic policy, to have more just distribution and so on. It is necessary for Putin's administration, and even it's necessary for the big business who is around this administration. But they cannot understand their strategic interests. They want to have more and more now, and so on. And to bring, to take everything and to go to the offshore zone. Now we have some restrictions for this floating of capital, but not strong. About Belarus and Russia. First of all, we do have some connections of our left-wing militants. When we had Russian Social Forum, we had the guests from Belarus. In academic sphere, we are trying to have connections. But this is really very difficult because in Belarus, opposition, which is not 100% supporters of Lukashenko, is under the pressure. In Russia, it's more or less the same. So really, we have contacts, but to organize something together, except academic contacts, except conferences, and so on, it's difficult. And when we have left actions, they are attacked much more radically than when we have liberal actions. Only one example, one of the left leaders, professor, was arrested, and now he is under the arrest 4 months at home, and no court, no nothing, and no protests, nothing from the West. And he is leader of one of the left movements, movement for new socialism. So, and this is only one example. Much more strong pressure for the left than for liberal opposition. We have a similar situation with Belarus, and protest started in Belarus when situation became much worse in social sphere. They also had negative pension reform. They had terrible labor code. They had no growth of wages for many years, not many, but last 3-5 years. I don't remember now exactly 3 or 5, but it was no growth of wages, and it was growth of social polarization and tension. And that creates background. But main driving force of these protests is, let's say, liberal-oriented youth, which are educated according to liberal standards, which have fantastic dreams about future. If they have freelancers in neoliberal Western-oriented economic system and so on. And they are trying to make main provocations and so on. This is very briefly about situation and about West. Thank you for the question, Daniel. It's a really very important aspect. I want to stress, of course, Western administration of the Western countries, European Union, United States, first of all, secret services and Western capital, let's be honest, they are doing a lot of negative for Russia efforts to support neoliberal opposition and to support right-wing forces. But their activity is not the reason. This is a factor which can accelerate protest, which can move to the right the protest, but it cannot initiate protest. The contradictions inside country are main reasons for the protest actions.
Okay, great. A final round of questions, Oscar and then Alan.
Yes, my question is brief. How severely has the Russian economy felt the crisis of 2020? We see that around the world, in general terms, about 10 years have been lost in economic development in the second quarter. In some countries, it's more. Italy was like 30 years. In some countries, a little less, but the average is about 10 years. And there has been a quick recovery in the third quarter. Now, the question is, what happened in Russia? Did you have this economic shock going down with a big bounce coming back up? Or is it a drop and it has not bounced? Or maybe it did not drop?
Maybe I will comment very briefly, or Alan, you and then me, okay. Alan, I cannot hear you.
Microphone.
Yes, I know. My mouse couldn't find my microphone. So I have to put some cheese on it or something. Okay, now I think I have two questions. One is about the international position of Russia, and the other is about the left in Russia. Because it seems to me, what is the goal of America is the most important question. The goal of America is to prevent an alliance that can oppose it. So, because at present, it's actually in danger of losing even its military hegemony, never mind its economic hegemony. All this stuff about sending aircraft carriers is actually a bit desperate, because there are places their aircraft carriers can no longer safely go. I mean, they can put on a show, but they can't have a war in the South China Seas and win it. They can't have a war in the Straits and win it. They know that, the military leaders. Trump tried to make them start a war, and the advice he was given by his military leaders is you can't do it because you will lose. They have to break Russia away from China. It's as simple as that. That, it seems to me, is the goal of American policy. Now, in this sense, for me, yes, I don't agree with an alliance with Putin, but Putin is standing up against America and is basically with a wing of the Russian leadership that, for the present, is preserving alliance with China. This has huge effects. If you look at Syria, Syria would have been divided into 5 pieces 20 years ago, 10 years ago, if it wasn't for what the Russian military are doing there. So this is very important. Now, the problem is this is tied up with the fact that it's a neoliberal wing of anti-imperialism, essentially. and it's pragmatically anti-imperialist. So what you need in Russia is a left which is both socialist and anti-imperialist. Now, I think that the left in Russia, from my experience, is bigger than what you suggest. The interesting thing about the Belarusian discussion is at the very end of it, we discovered there were actually three forces, not two, and that the Communist Party in Belarus had split, and one wing of it was essentially, socialist, anti-imperialist, and so on. Now, from my experience in Russia, I think the left forces are gaining in strength. All the conferences that you invite us to, that with Bodrunov and so on, each time we go there, the left is stronger. That's clear. The social movement. I understand that in the last election, the left's showing was actually much greater than the election's results gave, which is why I'm a bit suspicious about the 4% for Navalny figure, because the elections were massively rigged. So I think that the left in Russia, my impression, you know better than me, is maybe it's stronger than you are suggesting. And certainly there's an anti-imperialist socialist left in Russia, which needs to get structure and voice. We don't see it because its organizations are prevented from expressing themselves in any way. But on the ground, the impression I have is definitely there. And you have forces at top level like Glaziev and so on, who I think plays a very progressive role in general.
Okay, great. Thank you. Sasha, last set of remarks.
Yes, I try to be brief. Typically, this is the beginning of lecture. In Russia, we have not so big economic decline. We are expecting -5%, not catastrophe. Of course, this is bad because before we had the +1, -1, so it's bad. Why not radical decline? Mainly because we have a main part of economy concentrated in the sphere of gas, oil, and so on. And in pandemic situation, we continue to produce all these materials and export all these materials. Second, the military-industrial complex, all enterprises were working. So the situation is bad, but not catastrophic. As far as international content, really, I like geopolitical economy, but I don't like geopolitical games and all these talks about leaders, political confrontations, and so on. What I can say briefly, alliance between Russia and China has a lot of problems, and not only because of the United States. Russian business and Chinese business are competitors, and this is very visible. And to work together, it's necessary to have in Russia strong state regulation, strategic planning, and so on. We don't have in Russia. I was in China many times, and typically Russian side is responsible for the low level of cooperation. It's a very capitalist relation. We have very capitalist market relations, competitive relations, unfortunately. We need to have something in other, but we don't. As far as left, it's a big question mark, and again, it's necessary to explain details. We have, let's say, left trends inside population. More than 60% of population support ideas of socialization of economy, free of charge education, progressive income tax, and even socialism. Majority is more or less left, social democrats and more left, majority. But we don't have strong left political organization, which can be motor of the struggle, not of the political games, but struggle, real struggle for such turn. And without struggle, our oligarchs and bureaucrats never will give a piece of power, piece of property, piece of wealth to ordinary people. They don't want to have reforms. They want to keep everything in their hands. And this is dead end, unfortunately. About anti-imperialist trends, it's a very strange situation when absolute majority of population is anti-imperialist. Nobody wants to see that Russian business also have some imperialist ambitions, but it is too weak to be imperialist. That's why Russia is not imperialist country, not because they don't want, but because they cannot to be imperialist in the world economy, except a few corporations. And in this case, we have strange unity. Russian people support official leaders, president, and so on in foreign policy. And there are some real bases for this, including Crimea question, Donbass question, anti-imperial, anti-US policy in many spheres, anti-NATO policy, and so on. So in some aspects, it's progressive course. And this is also a problem because when you say, I don't like Putin's policy, everybody's ask, you want to make Ukrainian fascism everywhere? Do we want to have United States dominating Russia? And so on and so forth. So it's a big contradiction. And sometimes you need to divide foreign policy and internal policy of our leaders. But even in internal policy, there are a lot of forms of, there are a lot of attempts to find compromise with imperialist stratas. And our officials are not 100% anti-imperialist, definitely. So it's very brief and very schematic. Real contradictions are much more complex. Thank you very much for the interest to our country, to all these questions. Really, I'm specialist more in political economy of modern late capitalism, and Radhika knows this very well, and Alan. And this is my favorite topics, but urgent questions are urgent, and I'm glad to give these comments. I'll make now small break. I will listen, but I will disappear from the screen, okay?
Okay. Thank you, Sasha, and you know, one of the things we could perhaps plan a larger panel on is Russia somewhere down the road as further developments occur as well.